It was a quiet evening in Boston, Massachusetts, the golden light spilling through my kitchen window as I stirred my tea. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of dogs barking outside. My son sat across the table, his eyes cold, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard. In that moment, I realized something. The boy I had once rocked to sleep no longer saw me as his mother, only as a burden. But what he didn't know was that the papers in my drawer still carried my name, and soon the whole city would too. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and stay till the end. It happened on a quiet Sunday evening, the kind of evening that used to make me feel proud of my home and my family. The table was set, the aroma of roasted chicken filled the air, and the television murmured softly in the background. My son sat at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone, barely looking up. His wife was arranging the salad, her expression blank, as though she were merely fulfilling a duty. I stood there, holding the bowl of soup I had made from scratch, thinking how far we had come, or at least how far I thought we had come. Years ago, this same boy used to run into the kitchen, wrapping his little arms around me, begging for an extra slice of bread. Now, he barely noticed I existed. That night, I realized the distance between us wasn't measured in rooms or years. It was in respect, and that respect was gone. I tried to place his plate in front of him, as I had done countless times before, but he waved his hand, as if swatting away a fly. He didn't even meet my eyes. He pointed toward the corner, where the dogs were eating from their bowls on the floor. His voice was sharp, cold, and final. The words were simple, yet they cut deep enough to draw invisible blood. He told me to eat with the dogs. For a moment, I stood frozen, holding the plate midair. My heart seemed to stop. I thought maybe I heard him wrong. Maybe he was joking, but no one laughed. Not his wife, not even the dogs, who looked up briefly and then went back to eating. The silence in that room was heavier than any sound I'd ever known. My son didn't look ashamed. He looked annoyed, as if my very presence at the table ruined his peace. The moment stretched on forever. My hands trembled, the spoon clinking against the edge of the bowl. My throat tightened, but I didn't speak. I couldn't. I set the plate down gently and stepped back. My body felt heavy, my legs weak, yet my face stayed calm. A mother learns over the years how to hide her pain. She learns how to smile when her heart is breaking, how to pretend everything is fine because that's what mothers do. But inside, something quiet and steady began to shift. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness either. It was clarity, the kind that comes when you finally see the truth for what it is. I looked at the dogs, their tails wagging slightly as they ate. They had no malice, no pride, no cruelty. They simply existed, content and loyal. In that moment, I realized they showed me more respect than my own son had. The food didn't matter. The insult wasn't about where I should eat. It was about what I meant to him, or rather, what I no longer meant. Years of sacrifice, of sleepless nights, of quiet prayers whispered for his success, had been reduced to that single gesture. My worth in his eyes had fallen below even the family pets. There was a time when I would have begged for his kindness, when I would have asked him why he spoke to me that way. But that evening, I didn't ask. I didn't cry. I just stood still, watching him eat, realizing that the boy I had raised was gone. The man sitting there was someone else, someone cold, self-centered, and blind to love. I went to my room after that, my steps slow, careful not to make a sound. The walls of that house felt smaller that night, pressing in like a cage. Everywhere I looked, I saw memories. His first school uniform, the photo of him and his father, the graduation picture where he had smiled so proudly. I touched the frame and wondered where that smile had gone. Maybe success took it away. Maybe comfort replaced gratitude. Maybe I had given him too much, too easily. My husband used to say that children forget struggle when they've never tasted hunger. I used to disagree, believing that love was enough to keep them humble. That night, I realized my husband had been right all along. As I sat on my bed, the sound of the dogs' bowls clattering in the kitchen reached my ears. I didn't feel angry toward them. In fact, I envied their simplicity. They didn't care who owned the house, who paid the bills, who sat where. They only cared about loyalty. That was something my son had lost. The ability to be loyal to the person who once carried him in her arms. I thought of all the times I had stayed up when he was sick, the times I skipped meals so he could eat, the times I said no to myself so I could say yes to him. Each memory felt like a small knife twisting in my chest, not because I regretted them, but because I finally understood they had all been one-sided acts of love. A mother gives endlessly, but sometimes that giving blinds her. She doesn't see that the more she gives, the more some children take her for granted. I stared out the window that night and saw the lights of the neighborhood glowing softly in the dark. Somewhere nearby, laughter drifted from another home, a family sharing dinner perhaps, or telling stories. I had that once, but not anymore. My house was full, yet I had never felt lonelier. Respect, once lost, cannot be begged back. It must be earned, and he had no intention of earning it. That moment by the table changed everything. I didn't shout or demand an apology. I didn't argue or defend myself. I simply accepted what had been revealed. That love without respect is nothing but a burden, and I had carried that burden for too long. That was the night I stopped being the mother who forgave everything. I stopped waiting for my son to realize my worth. Because when someone tells you to eat with the dogs, they are not insulting your hunger. They are erasing your dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, becomes the sharpest form of quiet revenge. That night after the insult, I sat by the small window in my room, the light from the street spilling in faintly, and my mind began to drift backward in time. I remembered him as a child, a tiny boy with messy hair and wide eyes who used to cling to my sari whenever thunder struck. I remembered how he would hide his face in my lap and whisper that he would never leave me, not even when he grew up. I used to laugh and stroke his hair, promising him that no matter how big he became, he would always be my little boy. Those memories felt like a different lifetime now, belonging to another world entirely. One where love was pure, not poisoned by greed and pride. I could still see the old one-room house where he grew up, the cracked walls, the leaky roof, and the evenings we spent together counting coins to buy his school books. His father used to work long hours at the mill, and I took sewing jobs from neighbors to afford his tuition. Some days I went without lunch so he could take a proper meal to school. I never told him. Mothers don't tell their children about their hunger. They just smile and say they're full. The sacrifices were small in the moment, but over the years, they built his entire future. Each sleepless night, each skipped meal, each tear I wiped quietly in the dark, they became invisible bricks in the foundation of his comfort today. I remembered one rainy night when he fell sick with fever. The medicine cost more than we could afford. I pawned my only gold earrings, a wedding gift from my husband, to buy it. He recovered within 2 days, running around the house again, laughing, never knowing what I had given up. But I didn't mind. Watching him laugh was worth more than any jewelry. Love was simple then. It wasn't about money or ownership or pride. It was about care, and I gave it freely, never expecting repayment. When his father died, I thought the boy would become my strength. He stood beside me at the funeral, holding my hand tightly, and promised he would take care of me. I believed him with all my heart. He was my only child, my only reason to keep going. I sold what little we had to send him to college, proud that my son would become the first in our family to earn a degree. I took a small job cleaning houses, so I could send him extra money for his rent and food. Each letter he sent made me feel like everything was worth it. The struggles, the long days, the loneliness. Every time he wrote, "I love you, Mum," my tired body found new strength. Years later, when he returned home wearing a suit and driving a car, I thought my life's purpose had been fulfilled. He looked successful, confident, and I felt proud. I imagined we would live peacefully together, that he would care for me as I had for him. But slowly, I began to see changes. He spoke differently, softer in tone, sharper in meaning. He began to treat me like a guest in my own home, as if I was an old piece of furniture taking up too much space. His wife arrived soon after, polite in the beginning but distant. She would roll her eyes when I spoke, hide her laughter behind her phone, and whisper things I pretended not to hear. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself they were just adjusting, that things would get better. I helped raise their children, cooked their meals, washed their clothes, and kept the house running smoothly. Whenever guests came, I was introduced as Mother, but treated as a servant. They called it respect when others were around. But once the doors closed, I became invisible. I could see the change in his eyes. Not anger, but indifference. Indifference is worse than hatred because it erases you without a sound. I remembered one winter evening when he brought home a brand new dining table. He told me it was too small for everyone to sit together, so I could eat later. That was when I began to understand. My place in his world was shrinking, first from his conversations, then from the table, and finally from his heart. I told myself it didn't matter, that as long as he was happy, I could bear anything. But love should never mean accepting humiliation. That lesson came too late, but it came strong. As I sat in that dimly lit room that night, memories collided like waves in my mind. I saw the little boy he once was, the man he became, and the mother I used to be, all trapped in a loop of love and pain. It's strange how the same hands that once fed him rice grain by grain now trembled because of him. The same heart that once beat faster when he smiled now ached when he entered the room. I realized I had built his life by slowly dismantling my own. I had poured every drop of myself into him until there was nothing left but quiet emptiness. But that emptiness was starting to change. It wasn't weakness anymore. It was space. Space to breathe, to think, to plan. I knew I couldn't keep living like a shadow in the home I built. The slap of his words, telling me to eat with the dogs, wasn't just an insult. It was an awakening. Love had blinded me for too long. I finally saw the truth. A mother's love is powerful, but it should never make her powerless. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with calm, cold clarity. That night, I decided I would no longer be the woman who waited for respect. I would become the woman who demanded it, not through shouting, not through tears, but through action. My love for him hadn't died. It had simply changed form. It was no longer the love that served. It was the love that taught. And soon, my son would learn a lesson he would never forget. That night, the house was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the faint sound of dogs breathing outside. I sat at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing the rim of an empty teacup, the steam long gone cold. The words my son had said still hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Eat with the dogs. I whispered them again under my breath, not out of pain now, but disbelief. How easily love can be forgotten. How quickly kindness can be turned into weakness. I thought about leaving that night, taking only my shawl, my photo album, and a few clothes. But then I looked around at the walls, the same ones my husband had painted decades ago, the floors I had scrubbed, the windows I had cleaned until they shone. This was still my home. I had built it. And suddenly I realized no one could throw me out of what I created with my own hands. I made myself a small cup of tea, though it tasted bitter. Every sip felt like swallowing my pride, but I did it anyway. My heart was heavy, but my mind was awake, sharper than it had been in years. I knew I couldn't fight him with anger. He had money, power, and pride on his side. I had only one thing left: truth. Truth doesn't need shouting. It just needs patience. I decided right then that I wouldn't cry anymore. I had wasted enough tears trying to understand a man who no longer remembered his mother's sacrifices. Instead, I would remind him, not through words, but through actions he couldn't escape. As I sat there, I began to think of all the papers stored away in my old trunk, the ones his father and I had signed together. I hadn't opened that trunk in years. It was full of memories, both sweet and painful. My wedding soiree, a few old photos, and our property documents. My husband had been careful, always reminding me to keep them safe. "You never know, my dear," he used to say. "People change when money grows." I had laughed then, never believing his warning. Now those words echoed in my ears like prophecy. I knew what I had to do. I just needed to gather my strength to do it. The dogs outside stirred, sensing movement in the house. I walked to the back door and opened it slightly. They wagged their tails when they saw me. I took a piece of leftover bread and placed it in their bowls, kneeling beside them. They ate quietly, their eyes soft and trusting. I smiled faintly. Even animals knew gratitude better than humans sometimes. I sat there for a long time, stroking their heads, feeling their warmth ease the coldness that had settled inside me. My tears didn't fall anymore. They had turned into something else, determination. When I finally stood, the night had deepened. The moonlight streamed through the window, pale and steady. I looked at my reflection in the glass. An old woman, tired, but not defeated. My hair had turned silver, my hands wrinkled, but there was still fire behind my eyes. Age doesn't take away your strength. It only changes its shape. Mine had changed into quiet resolve. I wasn't going to beg for respect anymore. I would claim it, piece by piece, starting from what was rightfully mine. I thought about my husband again, about how hard he had worked to buy this land. Every corner of this house carried his memory. The garden he had planted, the swing he built for our son, the old clock he repaired with patience. He would never have allowed anyone to speak to me that way. And suddenly I felt him there, not in body, but in spirit, reminding me that I was not alone. For years I had tried to be the peacekeeper, the gentle mother who absorbed every wound without complaint. But that night, I understood something powerful. Silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means surrender, and I was done surrendering. I went to my room and pulled out my old trunk. The hinges creaked as I lifted the lid. Inside lay the faded documents, tied with a red ribbon. My fingers trembled as I untied it. The papers were still intact. The property deed, the land registration, the will. My husband's name was there, and beside it, mine, written clearly, legally, permanently. My son might have forgotten, but the law hadn't. This wasn't just sentiment. It was proof. Proof that everything he called his was still under my name. That realization filled me with a calm strength, not revenge, just balance. I placed the papers carefully on the table and stared at them for a long time. They were more than ink on paper. They were the story of my life. Every sacrifice, every hardship, every act of love that had built this home. I realized that my son had only inherited comfort, not the struggle behind it. And that was why he never valued it. People forget what they didn't have to fight for. I did not hate him. I pitied him. Because someday he would understand what he had lost. And by then, it would be too late. The clock struck midnight. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back in the box. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would visit my lawyer, my husband's old friend. I would tell him everything, calmly and clearly. I wouldn't accuse. I wouldn't cry. I would simply take back what was mine. My son might have treated me like a servant, but I was still the owner of the house, the mother who had built his world. That night, for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had made a decision. And when I woke up the next morning, something inside me had changed forever. The fear was gone. The sadness had turned into steady courage. I looked at the empty dining table where he had once humiliated me, and I smiled, not out of bitterness, but clarity. My silence had been mistaken for weakness. Now it would become my greatest strength. What I planned to do next wouldn't just reclaim my dignity. It would teach him a lesson no shouting could ever deliver. That a mother's patience has limits, but her wisdom has none. The next morning, after a long night of thinking and remembering, I went straight to my old wooden box in the corner of the room. It was dusty and forgotten, hidden beneath blankets and old photo albums. The box had been my husband's idea, a safe place to keep important documents, property papers, and memories. I knelt beside it, feeling the weight of years pressing down on me. Every creak of the lid sounded like a whisper from the past, reminding me of the life I had built, the sacrifices I had made, and the betrayal I had endured. Inside, the papers were exactly as he had left them, neatly stacked, tied with faded ribbons. I picked up the property deeds first. My fingers traced the ink, reading the names over and over. His name was there, yes, but so was mine, in small letters, co-owner, legal, undeniable. I had forgotten, in my quiet patience, the power that still rested in my hands. My son might have thought the house was his, that my love made me powerless, but the truth was written clearly on those papers, waiting for me to claim it. I spent hours going through every document. There were land deeds, property transfers, mortgage papers, and even old letters from my husband explaining his wishes. He had been careful, wise in a way I hadn't fully appreciated until now. He had known that one day someone might try to take advantage of my kindness. Someone might think love meant weakness. He had ensured I would have the final word. My heart swelled as I realized that my husband had left me not only memories, but protection, a legal shield to safeguard the home we had built together. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every penny we had saved was still under my name, and I held it as proof that my life, my efforts, and my dignity were never truly gone. Next, I found the old letters, yellowed and brittle with age. Each letter was filled with my husband's handwriting, reminding me of our life together, our struggles, and his deep respect for the home we created. He had written about how he trusted me to take care of our family, and how he hoped our son would always understand the value of love, work, and honesty. Reading those letters, I could almost hear his voice, calm and steady, reminding me that I was never alone, that I had the strength to do what was necessary. My eyes blurred with tears, not from sadness, but from a mixture of grief and resolve. I understood fully now that what my son had forgotten, that respect, patience, and trust were earned, could be reminded to him, not with anger, but with clarity, evidence, and action. The more I studied the papers, the more a plan began to form in my mind. I would not act in haste, nor would I act in vengeance born of anger. I would act in the calm certainty that comes from knowing the truth. I realized that the house, which he treated as his entitlement, could be reclaimed legally, quietly, without public fights or embarrassment. I could hire a lawyer, the same one my husband had trusted, and take back what was always mine. It would not just be property, it would be justice. The reminder that respect cannot be demanded with shouting. It must be acknowledged through accountability. I felt a flicker of hope and power that I hadn't felt in years, a sense that perhaps this insult, being told to eat with the dogs, was the very spark I needed to reclaim not just my home, but my self-respect. I gathered all the documents carefully, making sure they were in order. Each paper was a shield, a weapon, and a testament to my life. I stacked them neatly in a folder, the edges aligned, the ribbons still tied, and placed them on the kitchen table. I thought about my son sitting across from me at the dining table the night he insulted me, the anger and pride in his eyes, and I realized something important. He had thought that his words could diminish me, that his disrespect could erase decades of love and sacrifice. But those papers reminded me, the foundation of a life built on care and work does not crumble because of thoughtless cruelty. I could feel a calm strength settling into my chest, replacing the hurt, the humiliation, and the shock. This was my power, my quiet revenge, the proof that even when love is disrespected, justice can still be claimed. I spent hours that morning reviewing every signature, every clause, every detail. I remembered my husband's advice. Keep the proofs close, my dear, for one day they may speak louder than any words. And now the papers were speaking. They were louder than the insult, louder than the disbelief, louder than the moment when my son had treated me as if I were invisible. I felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that I could reclaim my space, my home, and my dignity without having to shout or beg. The law, coupled with truth, was on my side. I had built this life, I had nurtured it, and now, finally, I could protect it. By the time the sun was high, I had everything prepared. The papers were ready. My mind was ready. My heart was steady. I could almost see the future. My son staring at the legal documents, unable to argue, unable to deny. The weight of his words, the humiliation, and the years of taking my kindness for granted would fall flat against the clarity of truth. And I realized then, fully, that I was not doing this out of anger or revenge alone. I was doing it for myself, for the life I had built, and for the motherly love that had never failed, even when it was not returned. I was going to reclaim what was mine, calmly, legally, and with dignity. That afternoon, I made my way to the law office where my husband's old friend, a kind and honest man, had been waiting for me. I remembered him from years ago, the one who had handled our papers carefully, explained everything in detail, and never let emotion cloud his judgment. The office smelled of polished wood and old leather chairs, comforting in a way that reminded me of quiet afternoons spent planning our future with my husband. I sat down across from him, placing the folder of documents carefully on the table. I felt a sense of calm as I opened the folder, letting the papers fall neatly into place. I explained what had happened, the insult, the humiliation, and the way my son had treated me in my own home. I told him about the slap, the words "eat with the dogs," and the shock I had felt when the person I had raised and loved so deeply had shown such cruelty. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I spoke quietly, but each word carried the weight of decades of patience, love, and sacrifice. He listened carefully, nodding, flipping through the papers, examining every signature, every clause, every mark that proved the house was legally mine, that I had the authority to act. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses, and for a moment, silence filled the room. Then he looked at me and asked, softly but firmly, "Are you certain you want to do this? Are you ready for the consequences?" I smiled gently. I had been certain the moment he told me to eat with the dogs. This was not about revenge born of anger. This was about standing tall after being pushed down for too long. I explained that I had prepared everything. The folder had all the proofs, and my mind was clear. I didn't want chaos, only justice, and a chance to reclaim the home that had been built with my husband's and my hands. He nodded again, and I could see that he understood fully. This was not a sudden decision. It was the result of years of careful thought, of remembering, of grieving quietly, and finally, of deciding to act. I handed him the signed letters, deeds, and notes from my husband, explaining the importance of each, how they proved my legal right and ownership. He took them with care, as if they were priceless, because they were. They weren't just papers. They were a record of my life, of my hard work, of the sacrifices made in the name of family. I explained that my son had forgotten respect, that my love had been treated as weakness, and that it was time to show him that truth and justice cannot be ignored. My lawyer friend listened, occasionally glancing up at me, his eyes reflecting both admiration and concern. He understood the delicacy. This was my son, my child, but he had crossed a line that could not be ignored. We spent hours discussing the legal strategy, the process of reclaiming the property, and the way to ensure it was done quietly, without unnecessary public attention at first. I insisted on clarity, on a methodical approach, and he agreed. He said that sometimes the law is the only way to teach a lesson, and he could see my resolve was unshakable. I explained that I did not seek to humiliate my son publicly, only to restore what was rightfully mine and show that disrespect has consequences. I remember the weight lifting slightly from my chest as we spoke. I had gone in with tension and pain, but the conversation turned it into purpose and action. Finally, we agreed on the next steps, filing the necessary paperwork, preparing the legal notices, and arranging the formal transfer of ownership. He assured me that with all the documents I had, the process would be smooth, legally sound, and enforceable. I felt a sense of relief, not from vengeance, but from knowing that for the first time in many years, I was in control of my life again. My lawyer friend also reminded me to be patient, that sometimes people don't realize the impact of their actions until they see the undeniable truth. I left the office that evening carrying the folder close to my chest, feeling a mix of anticipation and calm. For years, I had lived in quiet humiliation, watching my son take for granted my presence, my work, and my love. But now, the papers, the legal rights, and the careful plan meant I would reclaim not just the house, but the dignity I had been denied. I could almost picture my son's face when he finally realized that the woman he had insulted and ignored was capable of action, calm, precise, and unstoppable. It wasn't anger that drove me. It was clarity, reason, and the unwavering sense that respect is earned, and when it is denied, consequences follow. That day, walking home through the late afternoon sunlight, I felt lighter than I had in years. The folder was heavy, yes, but not with burden, with justice waiting patiently for its moment. And for the first time since he had spoken those cruel words, I smiled, knowing that tomorrow would begin a new chapter, one where I would no longer be invisible in my own home. The next morning, I woke early, the light of the sun spilling gently across my small apartment, and I felt a quiet determination settling over me. I dressed neatly, not to impress anyone, but because I wanted to carry myself with dignity, a dignity my son had tried to strip away the night before. I gathered the folder of documents carefully and carried it with me, feeling its weight as a symbol of the life I had built and the rights I had been ignoring for far too long. My lawyer was waiting at the television studio, a calm presence amid the buzz of cameras, microphones, and crew members moving quickly through the halls. I had never been on television before, never spoken publicly about my personal life, but today, everything had changed. Today, I was no longer invisible. We walked into the studio quietly, past the bright lights and the hum of equipment, past the busy staff preparing for the morning show. The host greeted us warmly, introducing me as a guest who would share a story about elder rights, family disputes, and the importance of knowing one's legal rights. I felt a slight nervousness, a flutter in my stomach, but it quickly faded as I reminded myself that I had done nothing wrong. I was not seeking revenge in the way the world often imagines it. I was seeking justice and a chance to show that silence in the face of disrespect is not strength. When the cameras started rolling, I sat upright in the chair, placing the folder neatly on my lap. My lawyer was beside me, a reassuring figure who had guided me carefully through every step of the process. I spoke slowly, using clear and simple words, explaining how I had raised my son, how I had given everything I had to ensure he would have a good life, and how one cruel sentence had changed everything in an instant. I did not mention names. I did not shout or cry. I spoke calmly, letting the weight of truth and years of sacrifice speak for themselves. I talked about the legal steps I had taken, about the careful planning and documentation, about how respect is not just a word, but a responsibility that can be enforced when ignored. The host listened attentively, nodding at appropriate moments, and occasionally asking questions that allowed me to clarify my points. "How did you feel when your son spoke to you like that?" she asked. I paused for a moment, then said simply that it was painful, that it was a shock, but that I had used that pain as a turning point. "Sometimes," I said, "we give love too freely, thinking it will be returned automatically. But respect must be acknowledged, or it disappears without notice." I could see the camera capturing every word, every subtle gesture, every calm breath. After explaining the situation and the steps I had taken, the host asked me to describe what had happened with the house. I placed my hands on the folder and explained that the property, which had always legally belonged to me, had been transferred carefully, lawfully, to a senior citizen's trust to protect it from neglect and disrespect. I emphasized that my actions were not born from anger, but from necessity, that when those we love forget the value of care, it is sometimes the law that reminds them. My lawyer chimed in occasionally, confirming the legality of the process and explaining how all documents were verified and binding. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that everything was in order, that no one could argue with the truth or challenge the facts. The cameras panned across my face as I spoke, capturing the calm, controlled expression that I had cultivated over the past months of quiet preparation. I could see the subtle tension in the host's eyes as she realized that the story was real, that it was not exaggerated, and that the power dynamics in families can be as fragile and as dangerous as any lawless situation in the world. My words carried weight because they were not shouted, they were not embellished. They were the honest testimony of a mother who had given everything and demanded nothing but basic respect in return. When the segment ended, I felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. I knew that the moment the footage aired, my son would see it. He would hear my calm voice telling the world that I had taken steps to protect what was mine, and that disrespect has consequences. I imagined his face, the shock and disbelief, the moment he realized that the woman he had treated as less than human was capable of action, capable of legal and precise retaliation without a shred of cruelty. I thought about how silence can be more powerful than any argument, how calm certainty can leave a stronger impression than shouting ever could. I left the studio quietly, walking down the street with my lawyer beside me, feeling lighter than I had in years. The world outside felt familiar, but I knew that inside everything had shifted. I had taken control of my life again, had asserted my rights, and had done so without anger, without drama, only with clarity and resolve. That day, the broadcast was a signal, not to humiliate, not to shame, but to demonstrate that dignity, patience, and lawfulness can correct even the deepest wounds of betrayal and disrespect. As I walked home that evening, I thought about my son and how the next morning he would see me on television, not angry, not begging for recognition, but calm, composed, and in control. It was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where the lesson would be clear, that love, patience, and hard work have their limits, and when those limits are crossed, action becomes necessary. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of a new chapter. One where I would finally reclaim my peace, my home, and my voice. That evening, I sat quietly in my small apartment, the light from the street lamps casting a soft glow across the room. I was drinking my tea, feeling the calm after the morning's visit to the studio, unaware that the most important moment was yet to come. Across town, my son had returned home from work, exhausted from a long day, expecting an ordinary evening. He switched on the television to catch the local news, as he usually did, unaware that this simple act would confront him with a reality he had ignored for years. The moment my face appeared on the screen, calm, composed, with my lawyer beside me, his entire world shifted in a second. He froze immediately, his hand hovering over the remote, his jaw tightening as he recognized my voice. I spoke slowly, explaining the situation, carefully detailing the years of sacrifice, the ways I had supported him, and the insult he had thrown at me the night before. He listened, pale and rigid, as the segment outlined the legal steps I had taken, the property transfer, and the protections I had put in place. The house, which he had assumed would always be under his control, now legally belonged to a senior citizen's trust. Each word sank like stones in his chest, heavier with every sentence. He was speechless, not because he didn't understand, but because the truth hit him harder than any words I could have spoken to him directly. He tried to look away, but his eyes kept returning to the screen. He saw me calm, dignified, and in control. No anger, no tears, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet authority of a mother who had decided that silence was no longer enough. Every detail he had ever overlooked, every small act of disrespect, every time he had treated me as less than human, was now visible to the world. He watched as I explained how I had taken action, not in vengeance, but to protect myself and ensure that the respect and dignity he had stolen could never be taken again. For years, he had assumed that love meant unquestioned loyalty, that I would always forgive, always serve, always stay silent. Tonight, that assumption crumbled before him. I could almost see his mind racing, the realization dawning that the small gestures of cruelty, the dismissive comments, the cold indifference, and finally, the insult to eat with the dogs had consequences. He had believed he could control me, manipulate me, and humiliate me without any pushback. But I had planned carefully, documented meticulously, and acted with precision. The calmness of my voice, the presence of the legal documents, and the public platform had amplified the impact. It wasn't just a lesson for him, it was a demonstration to anyone who assumed that age or love meant weakness. He shifted uneasily in his chair, unable to move, unable to respond. For the first time, he experienced the weight of responsibility and the reality that his actions could not be erased. He saw me not as the woman he could insult, ignore, and order around, but as the woman who had raised him, who had given everything for him, and who had the courage and clarity to protect what was hers. He was silent, but the silence spoke volumes: shock, disbelief, regret, and the beginnings of understanding, all wrapped into a single moment of realization. Across the room, the television replayed my calm signing of the property transfer, a legal act that now changed the course of our family's dynamic permanently. My son's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the remote, but he could not switch away. He could not escape the truth, and for the first time, he realized that the woman he had underestimated for years had always been stronger than he had imagined. He was speechless because there were no excuses left, no arguments, no rationalizations that could undo the clarity of what he was witnessing. I had acted, and the consequences were undeniable. I imagined him thinking of every small incident, every dismissive comment, every time he had ignored my needs or belittled my presence. Each memory replayed in his mind like a film, accelerated and painful. He had assumed that time, affection, and silence would protect him from accountability. But now, in this one televised moment, he had no choice but to face the cumulative truth. The power of quiet patience, combined with careful preparation, had finally manifested in a lesson he could not escape. I continued speaking on the show, explaining how important it is for children to understand boundaries, to honor the sacrifices of those who raised them, and to recognize that respect is not optional. My lawyer detailed the legal process, confirming that the actions were fully lawful and binding. I spoke with calm authority, and my son watched helplessly, realizing that he could not undo what had been done. The house, the documents, the public acknowledgement, it was all there, undeniable and factual. His usual arrogance, the way he believed he could always outrun responsibility, faltered in the face of this undeniable truth. By the time the segment ended, he was sitting still, frozen in place. He could not speak, could not look away, could not deny the reality that had been revealed. His eyes, usually sharp with confidence and control, were now filled with disbelief and a dawning comprehension of the pain he had caused. He had been forced, for the first time, to see me as the full person I had always been: a mother, a protector, a woman with rights, patience, and the courage to act. The world had watched, and he could not hide from it, even in the privacy of his own home. That night, the silence between us became profound. He called, then hung up. He sent messages, then deleted them. He had no words strong enough to challenge what had been done. The shock was complete, the lesson unavoidable. I sat quietly, sipping my tea, feeling a quiet satisfaction and relief. The voice that had once been ignored now carried weight. The mother he had belittled had finally become the person he could not dismiss. And in that quiet, I felt the first real sense of peace I had experienced in years, knowing that respect, once lost, could be demanded and restored without violence, without anger, only with truth. The next morning, my phone began to buzz constantly, dozens of missed calls, messages flooding in one after another, each ping louder in my mind than the last. It was him, my son, the boy I had raised with my own hands, now reduced to leaving frantic digital traces of his desperation. He had never begged before, never humbled himself in front of me, never admitted he was wrong. But today, the reality he had ignored for years was inescapable, and it forced him into a position he had never imagined, pleading for attention, recognition, and forgiveness from the woman he had disrespected. The irony was thick, almost suffocating, and I sat calmly, letting each notification pile up silently on the screen. He tried every method: text messages, missed calls, voicemails, each more urgent than the last. One message read, "Mom, please, I need to talk. I didn't mean it. I was wrong. But he couldn't finish it before sending another, a string of frantic letters that made his panic painfully clear. I did not answer, not immediately. I wanted him to feel the emptiness he had created for me over the years. He had treated me like a shadow in my own home, invisible and dispensable, and now I was returning that silence as a mirror to reflect the gravity of his mistakes. Each time the phone vibrated, I felt no anger, no excitement, only quiet satisfaction in knowing that the lesson had begun to sink in. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, casting warm light into my apartment. Yet I remained still, sipping my tea, listening to the notifications fill the silence. It was not cruelty that made me wait, but clarity. He needed to experience the consequences without interference. I remembered every meal I had skipped for him, every long walk to school carrying his forgotten lunch, every sleepless night spent worrying about his future. He had demanded everything from me and returned nothing but disregard, and now it was his turn to taste helplessness. I did not gloat. I observed, patient and unmoved. Then came the calls to the neighbors, the family members, and mutual friends. They were forwarding messages, asking if I had seen his texts, calling to tell me he was frantic and confused. I listened politely, acknowledged them without revealing my reaction, and allowed the ripples of consequence to grow. He could no longer hide behind his usual arrogance or charm. The public exposure, combined with his private panic, created a pressure he had never known. The boy who once demanded meals at his convenience, who told me to eat with the dogs, was now reduced to attempting to negotiate with silence and absence. It was a strange reversal, and I watched it unfold with quiet resolve. By midday, he had resorted to emails, long letters detailing his regret, describing how he now understood the value of respect, the importance of gratitude, and the pain his words had caused. Each sentence was a confession, each paragraph a testament to his shock. Yet still, I did not answer. The mother he had insulted was no longer available on demand. She was a force independent of his control. He had assumed that obedience, silence, and unquestioning love would always protect him. But now he was seeing that respect cannot be demanded through fear or habit. It must be earned and preserved, and when lost, it may take years to recover, if ever. I watched him struggle through his network, sending people to intercede on his behalf, trying to find loopholes, apologies, and shortcuts. He attempted reasoning, manipulation, and even subtle threats, hoping to bypass the consequences. But the truth is immutable. Property, law, and dignity are not swayed by charm or panic. Each attempt he made only highlighted his lack of foresight, his failure to honor the mother who had sacrificed so much for him. And as I observed from the quiet safety of my apartment, I felt a calm satisfaction, knowing that the lessons he had failed to learn as a child were finally manifesting in adult clarity. Even in his desperation, there was a subtle recognition that he had underestimated me. He had believed age, love, and familiarity meant weakness. He had assumed that my patience, my sacrifices, and my quiet endurance would never be met with action. Now, faced with undeniable truth, he was forced to confront the woman he had dismissed, and in that confrontation, though indirect, he was learning the value of boundaries, the necessity of respect, and the consequences of neglecting those who nurtured you. He could no longer manipulate, ignore, or demean. His mother's voice had been amplified through action and public clarity. By evening, he had exhausted every avenue he knew. His messages slowed, his calls less frantic. He was forced to sit with the shame, the shock, and the realization of his own behavior. And yet, through all this, I felt no satisfaction born of cruelty, only of justice restored. Justice, not in punishment, but in the undeniable reflection of truth. He had glimpsed the power of dignity, the authority of a mother who would not be belittled, and the permanence of actions taken with intent and foresight. Finally, I looked at my phone, at the dozens of missed calls and unread messages. I knew he had learned the first lesson, that disrespect has consequences, and silence can be as loud as a shout. I did not answer that night. He would have to come to terms with what he had done, on his own, facing the shame, the reflection, and the lesson that mothers, no matter how patient, are not limitless in endurance. The next steps would be his alone to navigate, but the foundation had been set, and he could not erase it. The law, the public eye, and my quiet authority had converged, leaving him speechless, humbled, and forced to reckon with the consequences of his own actions. The morning after the television appearance, the neighborhood was buzzing with quiet whispers that spread like wildfire. My son's friends, acquaintances, and even distant relatives were calling each other, trying to confirm what they had seen. Reporters had captured his reaction, though unintentionally, when he saw me on the screen. He was pale, frozen, and unable to move, a rare moment of vulnerability that no one had ever witnessed before. Those who had known him since childhood, who remembered his confident, commanding presence, were stunned. They could not reconcile the son they had admired with the man reduced to a silent witness of his own mother's triumph. Word traveled fast. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed curtains about petty family disputes now had an undeniable story to share. "Did you see what happened on TV last night?" they asked each other. The mother who was ignored and insulted, she took back her rights, and he couldn't even speak. I heard fragments of conversations as I walked through the streets, people recounting my composure, the calmness with which I had narrated my journey, and the quiet power of action over anger. Each retelling magnified the effect. He had underestimated the reach of dignity, the permanence of a mother's resolve, and the consequences of treating someone who had given everything to you with disdain. By afternoon, I received messages from former colleagues, friends, and distant family members. Many congratulated me quietly, some expressing disbelief at the courage I had shown. They wrote about how they had seen children disregard their parents, but rarely had they witnessed such a poised reclaiming of respect. "You've set a precedent," one message read. "This is how justice for elders should look." It was not vengeance for them. It was proof that patience, wisdom, and strategic action could restore balance without hatred or fury. And through all this, I felt a deep calm. My son had been humbled, not through confrontation, but through truth, clarity, and exposure. Meanwhile, at his house, chaos unfolded. Neighbors reported seeing his hesitation, the way he avoided meeting anyone's gaze. His colleagues reached out, awkwardly checking if the story was true. There were no public confrontations, no shouts or arguments, only a slow, heavy recognition that his arrogance and disrespect had consequences. The house he once called his domain now carried a shadow of public attention and private shame. Every visitor, every glance reminded him of that night, the words he had thrown at me, and the lesson he had ignored for years. And with every reminder, I knew my message had reached him. Respect is earned, and it can vanish in a single moment if taken for granted. By evening, my lawyer called to update me on the legal side of things. The property, the transfers, and the public declaration had created a secure position. There were no loopholes, no risk of contestation. He had been surprised at how composed I remained during the process. He told me, "Many people act in anger, but you acted in wisdom. You've taught a lesson without ever raising your voice." It was a confirmation I did not need, but welcomed quietly. Action was always louder than words, and the reaction around me proved that principle again. Across the city, people began to discuss the story in their own circles, at cafes, libraries, and even local markets. The tale of a mother who had been insulted, ignored, and devalued, yet returned with dignity and authority, resonated far beyond our street. Strangers offered support, shared similar stories, and expressed awe at the strategy, calm, and patience involved. My son's humiliation was not violent or loud. It was quiet, methodical, and visible to the public. In truth, that quiet exposure carried more weight than any confrontation could have. The world was watching, and through it, he was forced to face the magnitude of what he had done. Even his colleagues and business contacts noticed a change. Invitations to meetings were delayed, casual conversations grew strained, and subtle shifts in tone reminded him constantly that respect once lost is hard to regain. The story spread on local channels, blogs, and community newsletters, reinforcing the lesson: actions matter, and neglecting those who love you can have consequences far beyond the home. I observed all this from my apartment, sipping tea, feeding the dogs, and feeling a serenity that had been absent for decades. The world had acknowledged the injustice, and my son, the person who had belittled me, could no longer hide from it. Inside him, I knew, the lesson was beginning to take root. The pride he had carried for so long, the arrogance that allowed him to tell me to eat with the dogs, and the indifference that had made him blind to my sacrifices were all being confronted silently but firmly. There was no shouting, no physical confrontation, only undeniable truth. He had seen me stand tall, act with the law, and gain the attention and respect that he had denied me. And in that quiet, undeniable victory, I understood something profound. Action rooted in patience and clarity is far more powerful than anger or vengeance. By nightfall, the calls stopped. The flood of messages slowed to a trickle. He could no longer force the conversation, manipulate the narrative, or ignore the reality of his mother's strength. The house that had once been his symbol of dominance and entitlement was now a testament to the quiet authority I had reclaimed. And as I looked out of my window, watching the city lights shimmer against the night sky, I felt the calm satisfaction of a mother who had been wronged but had responded not with fury, but with intelligence, strategy, and patience. In those quiet hours, I reflected on the journey, the insult, the humiliation, the memories of sacrifices long forgotten, and the eventual reclaiming of dignity. The world had seen the story, he had felt the consequences, and I had preserved my peace. No loud arguments, no public shaming, only clarity, law, and truth. And as I prepared for sleep that night, I realized that the silence, the patience, and the unwavering action had been my greatest allies. My son's lesson was complete, and I, at last, had regained my rightful place, not just as a mother, but as a woman who refused to be diminished. In the weeks and months that followed, life settled into a rhythm that I had longed for, but never fully experienced. My son remained cautious around me, quiet and measured, but the tension that had once poisoned our home had begun to ease. I had moved into a small apartment not far from the city center, a place filled with light, warmth, and the simple joys that I had been denied for so long. Every morning, I stepped onto the balcony to feed the birds and watch the neighborhood stir to life, savoring the gentle rhythm of days that belonged entirely to me. There were no harsh words, no public confrontations, no reminders of humiliation. Instead, there was clarity, peace, and the steady assurance that I had reclaimed my dignity. I discovered that freedom has its own language, and it speaks in calm gestures rather than shouts. I met other seniors in the building, people who had endured similar family conflicts or had been taken for granted by children who had forgotten the sacrifices of a lifetime. They shared their stories over coffee, and I listened, realizing how widespread these silent injustices were. Many had never found the courage or means to act, resigning themselves to frustration and quiet suffering. My own action, broadcast through the television story and amplified by community conversations, became a source of inspiration. I realized that in reclaiming my own respect, I had quietly taught countless others that patience, clarity, and lawful action could restore justice without needing anger or confrontation. My son, meanwhile, learned a truth he could not avoid. Each attempt to speak or connect now carried weight. Every gesture of affection measured against the memory of the night he had told me to eat with the dogs. He began to understand that respect is not given because someone is a parent, nor is it secured by fear or entitlement. It is earned through recognition, care, and honoring the sacrifices of others. Slowly, he began to adjust his behavior, not because I demanded it, but because he could no longer ignore the consequences of his actions. He had seen firsthand the impact of underestimating the quiet strength of someone you take for granted, and it had left an indelible mark on him. The house that he had once regarded as his domain, which I had now transferred to a senior citizen's trust, became a symbol for him, not merely of my action, but of accountability. It reminded him that authority and comfort are fragile when built on disrespect and neglect. He could no longer approach me with the arrogance or entitlement of the past, and he began to offer small gestures of acknowledgement, subtle signs that he was beginning to grasp the lessons long overdue. And although I did not demand these gestures, I observed them with quiet satisfaction. It was enough that he had started to realize, in his own way, the depth of my love and the cost of his disregard. I also learned to embrace my own life fully, beyond the shadows of family strife. I joined local community activities, volunteered at elder support groups, and rekindled friendships I had neglected for decades while pouring myself into raising my son. Each interaction, each shared story, reminded me of the strength inherent in surviving betrayal and reclaiming one's own power. I found joy in simple routines, tending to my small balcony garden, cooking for myself without obligation, reading books I had long postponed, and walking the neighborhood streets without fear of judgment or confrontation. These moments were my reclamation of time, dignity, and self-respect. Through it all, I realized a profound truth. Revenge is not measured by public shaming or anger. True retribution lies in reclaiming your life and teaching lessons through action, strategy, and persistence. My son had learned this lesson, perhaps more deeply than any words or confrontations could have taught. I had taken the insult, the humiliation, and the indifference he displayed and transformed it into a measured response that preserved my integrity while exposing the truth. And in that transformation, I discovered the quiet power that comes from never being diminished by another person's cruelty. The television appearance and subsequent public attention were fleeting, but their impact lingered. I found strength in knowing that the world had seen the truth, and my son could no longer deny it. He began to repair our relationship in small, thoughtful ways, sharing meals, listening more attentively, showing respect in ways that were subtle yet meaningful. I did not need grand gestures or declarations of love. The smallest acknowledgments were enough to signify change. Respect, once ignored, was slowly being restored, not because of fear or coercion, but because the lesson had been understood. Even now, as I reflect on those painful years, I am grateful for the awakening that insult brought. It forced me to confront not just my son's disrespect, but my own tolerance for humiliation. I learned that a mother's love is powerful, but it must also protect the self. Sacrifice is noble, but it should not render one powerless. And I learned that dignity can be reclaimed at any age, with patience, planning, and decisive action. I often sit by my window in the evenings, watching the city lights flicker, remembering the night I was told to eat with the dogs. I smile quietly at the journey that followed, the heartbreak, the reflection, the action, and ultimately, the reclamation of my life. My son has changed. The bond is tentative but respectful, and I have found peace in my independence. Life, I realized, is not about avoiding pain, but navigating it with wisdom, turning betrayal into clarity and action. In the end, I understood that the strongest lessons come not from anger, but from quiet, unwavering resolve. I had shown my son, and myself, that love and respect must be mutual, and that a mother's strength is limitless when guided by principle and purpose. The world had witnessed it, my son had felt it, and I had reclaimed my life fully. This is how a mother, long disregarded, found her voice, her power, and her peace. And as I sip my evening tea, I know that the lesson will last far longer than the insult ever could.